On a freezing February morning in 1986, on a steel bridge dividing the communist East from the free West, a thin man in a worn coat and cap steps into history. Soviet guards bark at him to walk straight, to cross the Glienicke Bridge in a clean, disciplined line. Instead, he deliberately walks in a zigzag. For 9 years, the KGB has tried to break this man. They have starved him, frozen him, isolated him in tiny punishment cells. They have called him a traitor, a spy, an enemy of the Soviet people. Now, in his very first steps toward freedom, he chooses to defy them one last time. His name is Anatoly Sharansky, later known as Natan Sharansky. The Soviet Union accuses him of being an American agent. The President of the United States publicly says that accusation is a lie, and the world knows that this man is something far more dangerous to a dictatorship than any spy. He is a man who stopped being afraid. To understand why his story mattered so much to both Washington and Moscow, you have to go back to the heart of the Cold War. You have to picture two superpowers staring each other down across oceans, missiles aimed, satellites orbiting overhead, computers humming in secret bunkers. On one side, the United States, with its booming electronics industry, microchips shrinking year after year, moon landings broadcast live into living rooms, a country where a teenager in a garage could tinker with a circuit board and eventually change the world. On the other side, the Soviet Union, a military colossus, yes. Nuclear submarines, intercontinental ballistic missiles, tanks rolling through Red Square. Their engineers can build rockets, they can send dogs and cosmonauts into orbit, but behind the parades and propaganda lies a brittle system that fears not just American weapons, but American ideas, American information, American technology. The Soviet leadership watches American color television, American computers, American satellites, and understands something terrifying. They are not just losing an arms race, they are losing a civilization race. And in the middle of this struggle stands a young Jewish mathematician from a city called Stalino, later known as Donetsk, in Soviet Ukraine. Anatoly is born in 1948, 3 years after Hitler's defeat, at the dawn of the nuclear age. His father is a loyal communist journalist working for a party newspaper. In their small apartment, the portraits on the wall are not rabbis or biblical heroes, they are Lenin and Stalin. From the outside, he looks like the perfect Soviet child. He joins the Communist Youth Organization, he recites party slogans. In school, he excels in math and logic, and above all, he plays chess. In that world, chess is not just a game, it is a weapon of prestige. Soviet champions crush Western players, and the regime boasts that communism produces superior minds. Anatoly becomes a local prodigy. As a teenager, he wins tournaments in Donetsk, gives simultaneous exhibitions, plays multiple games at once. Adults gather around the board amazed at the boy's calculating power. In another life, he might have become a Soviet chess grandmaster, a future rival to Bobby Fischer, Boris Spassky, or Anatoly Karpov. But history has other plans. In the 1960s, as America prepares to land men on the moon, Anatoly enters the Moscow Institute of Physics and Computer Science, one of the Soviet Union's elite scientific schools. There, behind dull concrete walls, the regime trains an intellectual class to compete with the West. They want brilliant physicists, mathematicians, computer scientists who can match American ingenuity. Inside the labs, huge Soviet mainframes whir and click the size of entire rooms, processing data far slower than the latest American machines. American integrated circuits, personal computers, Silicon Valley startups, those belong to another universe. The Soviet system tries to copy, but it can't replicate the culture of freedom that allows innovation to explode. Anatoly studies applied mathematics and computer science. He can feel the invisible ceilings. He knows that as a Jew, there are universities that quietly limit the number of Jewish students. Positions in certain research institutes are closed to him, no matter how talented he is. He is a particle in a machine that will never fully accept him. And then, something happens that shakes millions of Soviet Jews awake. In 1967, the tiny state of Israel fights the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria and wins a stunning victory in 6 days. In Moscow, the official newspapers condemn Israel as an aggressor, a tool of imperialism. But the Jews reading those lines feel something very different: pride. They see a Jewish army, Jewish pilots, Jewish tank commanders defeating Soviet-backed Arab regimes. They quietly tune in to foreign radio broadcasts, Voice of America, Radio Liberty, the BBC, catching static-filled reports about Jerusalem and the Western Wall. American transmitters beam uncensored information into the heart of the Soviet Empire, and in kitchens and bedrooms across the USSR, people twist dials, hide antennas, and listen. For the Soviet leadership, this is a nightmare. Radio waves originating in places like Munich and Washington bypass all their sensors. American technology is punching holes in the Iron Curtain. For Anatoly, this signals something else, a longing he never knew he had. Until then, his Jewish identity had been little more than a word on his internal passport, a mark that closed doors. Now it becomes a connection to a living people, a living state. He begins to seek out other Jews in Moscow, not in synagogues during services, that would be too obvious, but around the synagogue, in the streets, in apartments. There, young men and women meet to learn Hebrew from smuggled books, to study Jewish history, to whisper about Israel. It is here, outside the Moscow Choral Synagogue, that he meets a young woman named Natalia, or Avidal. She shares his hunger for a life elsewhere, for a life beyond the gray propaganda posters and endless lines of Soviet shops. They fall in love in a city where phones are bugged, neighbors inform on each other, and every foreign contact is suspicious. In the early 1970s, Anatoly makes a choice that will define the rest of his life. He decides to leave the Soviet Union and emigrate to Israel. For an American, the idea of moving to another country is simple. You get a passport, you buy a plane ticket, and you go. In the Soviet Union, it is an act of rebellion. To ask permission to leave is to admit that the socialist paradise is not a paradise. It is to tell the KGB, I do not belong here. The regime responds with humiliation and punishment. People who apply for exit visas lose their jobs, are kicked out of universities, sometimes even arrested. Still, Anatoly and Avidal file their request. They are denied. The officials tell him he cannot leave because he once worked in a research institute and therefore knows state secrets. It is a pretext. They want to make an example of him. He becomes what the world will later call a refusenik, someone refused the right to leave. Soon, he loses his job as a computer scientist, but instead of retreating into silence, he goes deeper into opposition. He learns English. He becomes a translator for Andrei Sakharov, the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb turned human rights activist. Imagine the symbolism for the Kremlin, one of your greatest scientific minds, the man behind your nuclear arsenal, now walks around Moscow with a skinny Jewish programmer giving interviews to Western journalists about political prisoners and human rights. The combination of science, moral courage, and foreign access terrifies the regime. As a translator, Anatoly sees firsthand how Western technology undermines Soviet control. Voice recorders, cameras, typewriters that are not registered with the police, photocopying machines. These simple tools become weapons of truth. In America, photocopiers and tape recorders fill offices, schools, and homes. In the Soviet Union, for decades, the regime kept strict control over copying machines. They knew that the ability to reproduce texts quickly could spread forbidden literature like wildfire. Every Xerox in the country was a potential threat. Dissidents still find ways. They type forbidden books, documents, testimonies on carbon paper, one sheet at a time, producing layers of faint copies, known as samizdat. They pass these bundles hand to hand. Some of those texts, smuggled to the West, are printed on American presses and broadcast back into the Soviet Union over American and European radio. The regime senses that the battlefield is no longer just tanks and missiles, it is information, and technology has tipped the scales. In 1975, the Soviet Union signs the Helsinki Final Act, a major international agreement that recognizes borders in Europe but also includes commitments to respect human rights. On paper, it looks like a victory for Moscow. The West recognizes the post-World War II map. In reality, it becomes a trap. Dissidents like Sakharov and Anatoly read the fine print. If the USSR signed a document promising basic freedoms, then it can be held accountable. They form the Moscow-Helsinki Group to monitor compliance. They gather evidence of abuses. They compile names of prisoners. They write reports. And who translates those reports into English and passes them to Western journalists and diplomats? Natan Sharansky. In Washington, another front of the Cold War is opening. American Jews and their allies lobby Congress to tie trade benefits with the Soviet Union to freedom of immigration. The result is the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which links economic relations to the right to leave. Once again, technology plays an invisible role. American computers, American grain, American industrial equipment are all bargaining chips. The Kremlin wants access to Western technology to modernize its outdated economy. Congress says, open your gates and maybe you can have it. The leaders in the Kremlin see the pattern. They want Western tech, Western money, Western respect, but to get them, they must make concessions on something they fear even more: control over people. And Anatoly is standing directly at the intersection of these pressures. By the mid-1970s, he is one of the most visible faces of the Refusnik movement. Journalists routinely seek him out. Diplomats know his name. As an American watching the evening news, you might have heard of Natan Sharansky, the Jewish dissident, standing up to the KGB. In Moscow, this cannot be tolerated. In early 1977, the Soviet government makes its move. The official newspaper Izvestia publishes a long article accusing Anatoly of being part of an anti-Soviet, pro-Western conspiracy. They suggest he's connected to foreign intelligence agencies. They paint a picture of a traitor being handled by shadowy forces in Washington. This is not just smear. In the Soviet system, the press often performs the prelude to prosecution. First comes the article, then comes the arrest. On a March day in 1977, KGB officers pick Anatoly up on the street in Moscow. They take him to the notorious Lefortovo prison. He disappears behind high walls and iron doors. For more than a year, he is held in pre-trial detention. Under Soviet law, this period is supposed to be limited, but in political cases, the law is elastic. Interrogators work in shifts. They deprive him of sleep. They threaten that he will be shot. They promise that he can see his wife again if he cooperates. They want him to confess that he is an American spy. They want to prove that the pressure from Congress, from human rights groups, from the Jewish community in the United States is nothing but the handiwork of the CIA and the Pentagon. Across the world, his wife Avital is waging a very different campaign. She has left the Soviet Union and now lives in Israel, but she does not settle into a quiet life. Instead, she barrels into Western capitals with one main demand: free my husband. She flies to Washington, London, Paris, Rome. She visits synagogues and churches. She meets senators, prime ministers, foreign ministers. She tells them that her husband is not a spy, that the charges are fabricated, that the Soviet Union is using him as a hostage in a propaganda war. In the United States, she finds a powerful audience. Jewish organizations, human rights groups, and ordinary citizens adopt the cause of Soviet Jewry. Rallies are held in front of the White House. Students picket Soviet embassies. Members of Congress raise Sharansky's name on the floor of the House and Senate. In this environment, something unprecedented happens. The President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, declares that Anatoly Sharansky is not an American agent. In effect, the leader of the free world calls the Soviet case a lie. For the Kremlin, this is infuriating. They are used to holding the narrative inside their borders, but now with global television, with satellite links, with powerful American media corporations broadcasting to millions, they cannot fully control the story, even at home. People tune in to foreign stations, they hear Carter's words, they start to doubt their own newspapers. Technology is undercutting the very foundation of Soviet propaganda. Meanwhile, inside Lefortovo, the interrogations continue. The KGB wants names. They want Anatoly to say that Western journalists, American diplomats, human rights activists are all coordinated by U.S. intelligence. They want a show trial that proves that the real enemy is not the ordinary Russians or Ukrainians, but the evil empire across the ocean. Anatoly refuses. The price of refusal is high. Almost all his contact with the outside world is cut. He's moved to harsher conditions. He knows that the court will do whatever the party orders. In July 1978, his trial finally begins in Moscow. It is effectively closed to Western observers. The charges: treason and espionage on behalf of the United States. If this were a Hollywood courtroom drama, the defense would bring witnesses, evidence, surprise testimony. In a Soviet political trial, the outcome is predetermined. This is theater, not justice. But even in scripted theater, an actor can refuse to read his lines. When the court gives Anatoly the chance to speak in his own defense, he does something that shocks everyone in the room. He turns to the judges and prosecutors and says, in essence, that he has no illusions. The verdict was decided long before this trial began. He describes how his interrogators tried to break him, how they offered deals if he would betray others, how they threatened to kill him if he persisted. Then he says something that resonates across continents. He looks beyond the courtroom, beyond the grim faces of the KGB. He addresses people he cannot see, but whom he trusts exist: his wife, his fellow Jews, his supporters abroad. He says, "Now, when I am farthest from my people and from my Avital, when I face many years of imprisonment, I say to my people, to my Avital, next year in Jerusalem." Then he turns back to the judges and says, "To you, the court, I have nothing to say." Those words leak out of the Soviet Union and are printed in Western newspapers, on the evening news in America, on black and white TV sets in Ohio, California, Texas. People sitting after dinner hear the story of a skinny Jewish dissident who told the KGB he had nothing to say to them, and everything to say to a free people and a free city thousands of miles away. For a dictatorship built on fear, defiance like this is a virus. The court, unsurprisingly, convicts him. Anatoly is sentenced to 13 years in prison and hard labor in special regime camps. He's loaded onto prison trains and shipped off to the network of camps and prisons that formed the late Soviet Gulag. Places called Vladimir Prison, Chistopol, Perm 35, places designed not to physically annihilate prisoners, as in the worst days of Stalin, but to slowly grind them down, to break their will. In those camps, the Soviets apply a kind of low-tech torture: food that barely sustains life, soup with a few floating crumbs of something that might have once been meat, thin slices of bread, no fruits, no milk, no proper vitamins. Winter cold that seeps through walls and into bones, work quotas that must be met regardless of health. and above all, isolation. For someone like Anatoly, the most feared punishment is not a beat-up or an extra shift of work, it's the punishment chamber, a tiny, freezing room with a hard wooden plank for a bed, removed during the day so the prisoner cannot lie down. A place where temperatures drop below freezing, where water leaks from the walls, where the light is always on or always off. If you talk, if you hum a tune, if you pass on a whisper of information, you can be sent there for days, then weeks, then months. Many men break. Anatoly does the opposite. He fights for small things that to an American might seem insignificant, but in a prison camp are matters of life and identity. He demands the right to receive letters from his family, the right to respond, the right to own a small book of Psalms in Hebrew, a little book of Tehillim that his wife managed to get to him. When the guards confiscate his psalm book, he goes on a hunger strike. When they deny him the right to see his mother, he refuses to work. When they try to force him to sign polite, submissive letters, he writes sharply instead. Every act of resistance is rewarded with more time in the punishment cell. There comes a time when he spends more than 100 days in those freezing, solitary chambers, one stretch after another. His weight drops dramatically. His body shakes. Doctors warn the authorities that he is close to death. The officers face a dilemma. They can let him die and risk turning him into a martyr at a time when American TV can broadcast images of grieving widows and angry rallies, or they can yield, at least partially. Reluctantly, they begin to restore some of his rights. They give back his psalm book. They allow a few letters. Even within the gulag, the fear of Western cameras and microphones, of American outrage, makes itself felt. Meanwhile, in the outside world, Soviet science continues to lag behind the West in key technologies. American microprocessors shrink, doubling in power every couple of years. The Pentagon deploys precision-guided munitions. NASA flies the space shuttle. The first stealth aircraft appear. The Soviet Union tries to keep up. They copy American chips. They try to steal designs through espionage. But copying is not the same as creating. Their computers remain bulky, buggy, behind the curve. Their economy, tightly controlled, cannot match the flexibility of the American system. The same contrast appears in information. Americans carry portable cassette players, record their own mixtapes, duplicate albums, record speeches. In the Soviet Union, a simple tape recorder can be enough to get you noticed by the KGB. In that world of constant monitoring, the human mind becomes one of the last free spaces. Anatoly retreats into his mind and returns to the world of his childhood, chess. He begins to play games in his head, without board or pieces. He imagines positions, calculates lines, plays against himself. White moves, black responds. He replays famous grandmaster games he memorized years ago. He invents new openings. Hour after hour, day after day, he runs mental simulations, keeping his brain sharp and his soul occupied. He later explains that this, more than anything, kept him sane. Think about what that means. In an age when the U.S. is building Cray supercomputers and developing advanced simulations, one dissident turns his own brain into a human computer, running endless calculations to survive. A single mind refusing to crash under pressure. He is not alone. Other political prisoners tap on pipes, develop secret codes, smuggle notes in shoes and books. They create a tiny underground network inside the camps, proving that even in the heart of the Soviet prison system, people can build their own intranet of courage and information without a single wire or chip. Year after year, Avital continues her campaign. She becomes a familiar face in Washington. American presidents change, but the theme of human rights and Soviet Jews stays on the agenda. Under Ronald Reagan, this theme becomes even sharper. Reagan calls the Soviet Union an evil empire. He speaks often of dissidents, of prisoners of conscience. Anatoly's name appears in speeches and briefings. American officials bring up his case in arms control talks. Imagine the scene. In one room, experts discuss throw weights of missiles, warhead counts, the range of Pershing II and SS-20 rockets. In the next breath, American diplomats say, "What about Sharansky? What about the Jewish refuseniks?" The Kremlin wants technology and trade. The Americans demand not only nuclear cuts, but also the release of men whose only weapons are words. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union is in deep trouble. Its economy is stagnating. Oil prices have dropped. The war in Afghanistan bleeds resources. The West, led by the United States, is pouring billions into military and technological innovation, from missile defense projects to advanced computing. A new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, realizes that if the USSR does not change, it will collapse. He launches glasnost, greater openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He wants Western investment, he wants Western technology, and he knows that to get it, he must address the human rights issue that has poisoned the Soviet image for decades. Behind closed doors, negotiators discuss a dramatic gesture, a large prisoner exchange between East and West, staged on a bridge that has already hosted smaller swaps, the Glienicke Bridge, between East Germany and West Berlin. Among the spies and agents to be traded, there is one name the Western side will not compromise on: Sharansky. On February 11, 1986, the operation unfolds like a scene from a Cold War thriller. Cars move slowly through the fog. On one side of the bridge stand Soviet and East German officials. On the other, American and West German representatives. Prisoners, thin and pale, are led out of cars. Among them, Anatoly, wearing a cap and heavy coat. He has been told he is going to be freed, but after 9 years of deception, he knows better than to trust the KGB. He braces himself. An officer orders him to walk straight across the bridge, but Anatoly has spent nearly a decade proving that he is not a puppet. He walks in a crooked path. From the Western side, observers watch, puzzled at first, then smiling as they realize what he is doing. At the very edge of Soviet territory, under the eyes of the secret police, this man decides that his first act of a semi-free person will be a small, almost comical act of rebellion. It is like a bug in the Soviet operating system, one unscripted line of code. A few steps later, he passes the invisible line. Now he is under Western protection. He is free. Within hours, he's flown out of East Germany. Very shortly after, he lands in Israel and is greeted by cheering crowds. He embraces Avital for the first time in 9 years. The image travels the world. The former prisoner of the evil empire, thin but smiling, stepping onto the soil of a free democracy. In the United States, people watch this on colored TV screens via satellite feeds that the Soviets could never fully jam. They see not just a personal story, but a confirmation of what they have long believed, that in the long contest between systems, between a society of fear and a society of freedom, the side with open information, with advanced technology, with independent citizens ultimately wins. In the years that follow, Anatoly takes a new name, Natan, and a new role. He could have retired quietly, written a memoir, and faded into history. Instead, he dives back into public life. He writes a detailed account of his struggle, Fear No Evil, which becomes a manual on how one man can resist an entire police state. He helps organize the absorption of hundreds of thousands of Jews leaving the collapsing Soviet Union, many of whom end up in Israel or the United States. And he thinks deeply about what he has seen. He knows that prisons come in different forms. Some are made of bricks and bars. Others are made of lies and fear. From this reflection, he developed a simple, powerful way to divide the world, not between left and right, not between rich and poor, but between what he calls free societies and fear societies. A free society, he says, is a place where a person can stand in the middle of the town square and say what he or she really thinks without fear of being arrested, tortured, or killed. A fear society is where you cannot. He calls this the town square test. Think of how that lands in an American context. For generations, Americans have gathered in literal and digital town squares, courthouses, campuses, newspapers, now social media, arguing, criticizing, mocking their own leaders. In the United States, an ordinary citizen can walk up to the gates of the White House with a sign calling the president an idiot and, as long as they obey basic laws, go home safely afterward. In the Soviet Union, where Anatoly grew up, such a stunt would have meant years in prison. This is more than rhetoric. For Natan Sharansky, the town square test is a diagnostic tool. It tells you, quickly, whether you are dealing with a country where governments fear their people or a country where people fear their government. From his cramped prison cell, he watched how much effort the Soviet state poured into controlling typewriters, radios, photocopiers, how terrified they were of foreign broadcasts. Compare that to the American landscape, where technology spread quickly, often ahead of regulation. The same technical superiority that put American footprints on the moon also helped break Soviet censorship. High-powered transmitters, accurate, stable frequencies, portable receivers, recording equipment, printing presses that could produce 10,000 copies in an hour rather than a handful in a night. It wasn't a single machine that brought down the Soviet Union. It was the combination of machines and people brave enough to use them. Sharansky also sees something else. In the modern world, hatred can travel as quickly as hope. In the years after his release, as he watches new forms of hostility toward Jews and Israel emerge, especially in democratic societies, he proposes another test, this time for a new kind of anti-Semitism. He notes that criticism of Israel is perfectly legitimate. In a free society, you criticize governments all the time. But there are 3 warning signs that criticism is crossing a line into old-fashioned hatred dressed up in new clothes. First, demonization, when a country is described not simply as wrong or mistaken, but as uniquely evil, beyond redemption. Second, double standards, when the behavior of one country is judged by criteria not applied to any other. When the same or worse actions by other states are ignored, but one state is singled out over and over. Third, delegitimization, when people argue not just against particular policies, but against a country's very right to exist. He calls this the 3D test. If your rhetoric about Israel includes demonization, double standards, and delegitimization, you may not just be anti-Israel, you may be reviving the ancient virus of anti-Semitism in a new form. Behind these tests is the same mind that calculated endless chess moves in a Soviet cell, a mind trained in mathematics and computer science, sharpened by the stark reality of an empire that was, in many ways, technologically powerful and politically primitive. In the early 2000s, he turns these ideas into another book, The Case for Democracy. He argues that lasting peace cannot be built with regimes that terrorize their own citizens, that dictatorships, even when they sign agreements, remain unstable partners because their survival depends on creating external enemies. When American leaders read his work, they see in it a reflection of their own narrative, that the United States, for all its flaws, has built a system where power changes hands peacefully, where ideas compete in the open, where the town square test is passed daily. In 2004 and 2005, President George Bush famously cites Sharansky's book as influential. the concept of spreading freedom, of encouraging democratic reforms, even in hostile regions, draws partly on the experience of watching Soviet dissidents help bring down an empire without firing a shot. For Americans, especially those who remember duck and cover drills, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the fear of nuclear annihilation, there is a particular satisfaction in seeing that the country that produced Silicon Valley, Apollo rockets, and global media networks also helped arm the most dangerous opponent of communism, the human conscience. The Soviets, with their secret police files and gray concrete ministries, poured money into stealing Western technology. They spied on computer companies, infiltrated defense contractors, tried to copy microchips. But there was one thing they could not steal, could not reverse engineer, could not reproduce in their own laboratories: the lived experience of free people using technology without fear. For Natan Sharansky, the story is personal. From the moment he applied to leave, through his years as a refusenik, through his trial and sentence, through the endless days in punishment cells, he saw one unbroken line: a regime terrified of its own citizens and a free world increasingly willing and able to shine a light on that fear. In the end, that fear society cracked. The Soviet Union collapsed. Its once mighty ministries broke apart. The KGB changed its name. The red flags came down. The prison gates opened for thousands of political prisoners and ordinary criminals alike. Natan did not bring down that empire alone, but his courage and the courage of people like him gave the West a moral high ground that no missile system could ever replace. Today, when you walk through an American city and pass a protest, when you flip through channels that insult politicians you may love or hate, when you stream a video critiquing your own government's policies without a second thought, you are living in a world that Natan Sharansky's story helps define. A world where the test of freedom is not how powerful your army is, but how safe your citizens feel when they speak their minds. And somewhere in Jerusalem, the city he once could only dream of, there is an older man who remembers the sound of the punishment cell door slamming shut, the taste of watered-down soup, the rhythm of imaginary chess moves in the dark, and the sensation of cold metal under his feet as he walked in a crooked line across a bridge from the heart of a fear society into the wide, unpredictable, loud, imperfect noise of the free world.